You're listening to Toronto's #1 real estate podcast, powered by Watson Estates. The most successful local real estate investing starts right here, right now. Here's your host, broker, investor, and social media influencer, Bradley Watson.
Good afternoon, investors. Bradley here from Watson Estates, coming at you a little later than normal. I had to run off this morning, but I wasn't going to leave you guys without a beautiful podcast leading into this weekend. People knock that Toronto real estate is in some kind of bubble, but you know who didn't stay in their bubble? Donald J. Trump, and the stock market is paying for it. Look what happened to him. But welcome to October, guys. I'm so thrilled we can be here. Thank you for joining us on the largest, fastest growing podcast for Toronto real estate on iTunes, Spotify, and Google Podcasts. Some of the topics we're going to cover today. What about Toronto real estate poses a bubble risk? Pretty much all the headlines today are talking about how Toronto's in this big fat bubble. We're going to talk about why UBS says that is the case. And will rising Toronto condo rental inventory spill over into prices of those condo units? We're going to talk a little bit about that. And given all the chaos and panic relating to COVID, should we really be panicking about COVID upon seeing the models being published by the health department or whatever the heck in Canada? We're going to look at all of these things. I'm so glad you guys could join us. And entering October, your timing is perfect because with Donald Trump getting hit by COVID, Donald Trump really is a walking jack-o'-lantern. Think about it. They're both orange, round, and will get thrown out in early November. We need a real president here. Right? Who do we need? Steve Jobs, right? Or something like that. But I guess you can't compare apples to oranges. It's kind of unfair. We're having some fun. Make sure you slam the subscribe button, hit that like, and let your friends know if you're not already on an investor list. Give us a heads up. We got a power of sale deal this morning. That's kind of why I came in a bit late. I had started doing the podcast ring up this morning and had to finish it this afternoon because I didn't want to leave you guys hanging. And the biggest article of the day, as I'm looking through it to share with my investor clients, is this: Toronto real estate poses bubble risk while Vancouver homes are overvalued. UBS says. Well, who is UBS? Well, they're a global firm that provides financial services in over 50 countries. And they're not the first. I mean, we just heard Moody's Analytics talking about the risk in our market. There's this big division, guys. There's a huge battle right now on whether our market is in a bubble and therefore head for the hills, or if this is a great opportunity to purchase something, get a hard asset in maybe one of the strongest inflationary periods we could experience in a long time. Again, wherever you stand on this, I want to make sure that we are getting the full picture, right? We're getting a full picture before we make that call, before we invest our real investment dollars in the local market. Here we go. The article reads, Toronto is one of 7 world cities most at risk of a residential real estate bubble, according to a new report released by UBS this week. Toronto scored 1.96 in the UBS Global Real Estate Bubble Index, the third highest score below Frankfurt and Munich, which scored 2.26 and 2.35 respectively. The bank's report scores 25 cities across the world, sorting them into 4 tiers. They are bubble risk, overvalued, fair valued, and undervalued. Toronto is in the bubble risk category, which is worse than overvalued for the third consecutive year, surpassing places like Hong Kong, Paris, and Amsterdam. UBS says Vancouver real estate has dropped out of bubble risk territory this year, but is still overvalued with a score of 1.37. We're not going to talk about Vancouver, but I thought that was interesting because they were on the list. The scores are based on how home prices compare to income and rents, and whether mortgage lending and construction spending are excessive compared to the growth in the overall economy. And I love this comparison. And once again, we're talking about the difference between the cost to purchase and own a home versus the cost of renting, or the cost of our income versus the cost of and renting a home versus construction, and all of these things. I'm not going to dive into it. I'm losing my words here. But the point is, if you think about what happened this year, the big differences, the big changes was we saw not only a decline in rent rates, which makes it more affordable to rent, and a bigger spread between ownership versus renting. But we also saw, despite that, even with incomes, we have a ton of construction projects coming on the market, and they're saying our economy is not growing. And we've seen that time and again. The only thing propping things up around here these days is Mr. Trudeau, right? The scores, they say, do not predict whether or when a bubble will pop and cause home prices to fall. The existence of a bubble, UBS says, cannot be proved unless it bursts. So that's their way of saying, ask your accountant. Ask your lawyer, right? And they've got this whole rating system, regardless, won't get into that, but they say we are in a bubble. Demand for single-family homes in the suburbs have pushed Toronto prices up nearly 6% in 4 quarters, stretching affordability, the report says. Moreover, the expected appreciation of the Canadian dollar, this is an interesting point, will curb the appeal of Toronto property to foreign buyers while travel restrictions are lifted. We're really banking on the foreign buyer here. Not foreign buyer, sorry, immigrant. People coming back once the doors reopen, if they ever reopen. But they're saying at a good point here, the Canadian dollar is getting a lot of strength, right? We've experienced that too. And that would mean less draw because you're buying dollars, your buying power is not as strong. And so they don't think in this article, as part of this whole thing, that immigration is coming back, at least not to the numbers we experienced before. Which gets my attention when I see articles like this from TheGuardian.com. A U.S. article says, how to move to Canada. Americans rush to Google after unwatchable debate. Google reports peak numbers of searches for how to apply for Canadian citizenship after chaotic Trump-Biden skirmish. Some people seemed in such a hurry to get out that they couldn't even get the name right. They typed Canada, C-A-N-D-A. Canada. How to move to Canada. And it spiked along with how to move to Canada. Both those things spiked shortly after the debate. In the beginning of the debate and at the end of the debate, they saw these big spikes. Poor Donald Trump, man. He gets such a bad rap. I mean, he is a smart guy, no? I mean, in fact, J in Donald J. Trump literally stands for genius, right? His mental health, I feel bad for the guy. He's going to go down the toilet by the time he's gone, whether it's this year or in the next 4 years. And you know why Trump takes Xanax? For Hispanic attacks. Oh, that's funny. Probably not right, but funny. In Vancouver, home valuations remain sky high, but have eased amid vacancy rates, a foreign buyer's tax, and less immigration. It's important to note, why is Vancouver off the list and we're not? And that's the reason. Vacancy fees, right? If you have a vacancy home, vacant home tax, foreign buyer tax, and now less immigration. After a 10% drop in price between 2018 and late 2019, the author said Vancouver home prices have stabilized thanks to falling mortgage rates and rules that let potential buyers qualify for higher mortgage loans more easily. So here's their solution. Vacancy tax, coming to a city near you in December. Go back and listen to our podcasts. Less immigration, right? Because you want to reduce that demand pressure. Lower rates to increase and make it more affordable. Unfortunately, being taken advantage by the select few that can actually apply for that. We'll talk about student debt loans and all these things in a minute. And easier qualifications. Make things easier for people to afford a property. Meanwhile, bringing down the demand. All of these things, they say, would be the solutions to us being in a bubble and bring us down to a more sensible option of being simply overvalued. The report's author said that 4 quarters of rising real estate prices during a global recession is unsustainable. It's very interesting to see globally real estate markets are being quite successful. It's not just here. And as the COVID-19 pandemic causes people to, quote, reconsider where to live, UBS predicts that there will be less demand for housing in cities. Why do they say that? There's 2 reasons. Number 1, they say the rise of the home office calls into the question the need to live close to city centers. Pressure on household incomes caused many people to move to more affordable suburban areas. Not a surprise there. But point number 2 is quite fascinating and amazing. Amazing. Listen to this. Point 2, already debt-ridden or economically weaker cities will have to respond to this economic crisis, namely Toronto, right? Toronto, with tax increases or public spending cuts, right? Neither of which bode well for property prices. Interesting point. The pressure that's going to be on the city, given the amount of spending that would be put in place with all of COVID, all these things don't go away. And so these pressures are going to lead to reduced property prices. There's going to be a need, in a sense, to prop up Toronto instead of focusing on all the energy to prop up these neighboring communities, ones that are, Thunder Bay and North Bay, far away from us. Maybe the big city, Toronto, should be the spotlight of trying to protect real estate prices. I don't know. Meanwhile, suburbs are doing great, right? We see Ottawa, We've seen Guelph. We've seen Niagara topping the top list of performing cities across the country. But we did this a few days ago, but we actually found Ryan, I'll give him a big shout out. He found a flaw in that article, and he looked at Windsor, where they're up in price 29%. So they definitely should have been on the list. So it calls into question how many cities were overlooked in that analysis. But the point here is there's a lot of neighboring cities close to Toronto that are getting propped up by this exodus to the suburbs and to the exurbs. UBS also urged first-time homebuyers to consider building up wealth with a focus on more liquid assets to diversify their investments instead of just their homes. Right? The current cities of bubble risk seem to be weathering the coronavirus crisis relatively well. The local economies in Munich, Toronto, and Hong Kong will likely recover quickly. So the direct benefit of being in this bubble is we recover very fast. But they add, even if home prices don't plunge, there isn't much more potential for capital gains. And this is the big play. The reason you buy near the city is to get opportunities in capital gains in the long term. And I got a comment from FP on YouTube. I just wanted to briefly highlight, are there going to be any increases to our capital gains to 75% plus tax for personal properties? Right now, it's obviously sitting at 50%. You investors out there know that. And of course, there's a potential, this risk of having your primary residence exemption removed. Well, it's led to me wanting to bring on an accountant, a good friend of mine actually from university days will be probably joining us this week. I'm hoping we get that up on Wednesday, talking about some of these things. And he posted, Owen Bigland out of Vancouver had a kind of a video on this. I think he does a pretty good job explaining it, very high level. But one of the things he doesn't talk about is this idea of a capital gains being lifted from 50% to 75%. The assumption in that is, well, I'm rich and I have all these properties and they're going to jack up the capital gains on all those properties. But that is taking history out of context, because what we've seen in the past where things like this have happened is this thing called a V-Day or a valuation day. And that is most likely how this would work. So that's not to say that you should be afraid. Don't be afraid of what you built so far. Instead, take advantage now of getting that maximum value before the tax rates go up. I hope that kind of makes sense. Don't be so caught up and I got 10 properties, I need to dump these things. And this is the reason they do V-Day, because they don't want people to start flooding the market in hopes of avoiding this changing capital gains tax. They just say, wherever you are today, we're going to leave it as is. We're going to reset and jack that number up, which means having some insight and listening to podcasts like this or guys like Owen, know that this could be an opportunity for you to snatch up a few more deals and maximize the value on those before something like this comes down the pipes and your rates are gone for good. They're gone for good, right? You want a sure way to piss off the investors' vote? Hit them with a capital gains tax. But Trudeau, I mean, let's face it, he's dodged scandal after scandal, so he won't get impeached. Is that what they call it in Canada? I don't even know, because I'm in conversation. I guess it is. But actually, as I think about it, conservatives, they wouldn't impeach Trump either, right? And why is that? It's because the conservatives, especially down there, they believe in carrying a baby to full term. That's rough. That's a rough one. Those are my favorite. All right, let's move right along. So we got a little bit for everybody here, right? And that really is an opportunity for those of you who are very bearish on our market. You're going to love that article. You're going to think, this is great. Ha ha ha, right? Well, let's transition a little bit. We're going to talk about some further bad news to even the playing field. From Better Dwelling, this question of will rising Toronto condo rental inventory spill over into prices? Their article reads, Toronto condo rental inventory is soaring and it might be driving people to sell. It might be driving people to sell is the key. It might, because they don't really know, but it might. We're going to talk about what they do have to say. Toronto condo rentals are seeing the most inventory in recent memory. And they take this all from realtor Daniel Foch, Foch, before I get censored on iTunes. There were 7,901 units for lease in September. Here's the numbers. That is up 96.4% from the same month last year. That's a lot. It really is. As for bigger months, only July and August have had more over the same time period. So this year, they're all seems to be this year that have been more. Okay, so they got these little charts, but the next key factor you need to keep in mind, other than the fact that we've had this number jump, the number of units for lease increased by 96, is the number of leases that actually happened. because that matters, right? How many's coming on versus how many's going out. Well, when we look at those numbers, they're still up, but they are only up by 44.9%. And therein lies a problem with a little thing called the absorption rate. What is absorption? Well, absorption is the number of homes sold during a period of time divided by the total number of homes available at the time, right? So really, it's what percentage of what was there is now gone. And so they're saying that this sent absorption levels back lower as landlords outpace renters significantly. And one of the things that I want to point out here, because they really jump into this rental absorption factor and how rental absorption is coming back down all of a sudden, right? We look in August to September, it's a massive drop. This is what they say. They say the rate fell 44% in September, down from 59% last year. The drop reverses what looks like an improving trend. So there was this trend that we seem to have absorption rates going up, going through this year. Well, all of a sudden in September, it's dropped big time. But you don't need to go any further than the charts that they provide in their article to see that's seasonal. If you look every single year in the past, there is a steep drop between September, October, and November. They look like cliffs every year. Forget this year. Now, this year, the absorption rates went very high. The number of units that were absorbed went very high. But these drops are not unusual. They seem to be more seasonal. And that's not to say that there aren't opportunities and that the rental market is absolutely hurting. It is. But we can't just overshoot the fact that there is some seasonality to the drops in the absorption rate. What they don't mention is here they say, so sorry, I'm going to skip that. I already made that point. We're going to move on. The whole point of this article, the clickbaitiness to it, is that all of a sudden we got all these rental units. It's going crazy. Absorption rate, we got all these issues right now in the rental space. And we also have issues in the purchasing space, right? We see a lot of months of inventory levels rising. We see deals coming on the market, people discounting properties. You see all of that happening. Well, they take the liberty, not to say it's wrong, but they take the liberty to say that they're connected. And they kind of map it out and you can see the trends are very similar. They say the increase in listings and sales volumes is expected to persist for the near term. This trend is due to slowing population growth, an influx of recent condo apartment completions. With immigration, the main driver of population growth expected to be stalled for the next year, it's difficult to see this trend reverse. So they're saying that these two things are related, whether they are or they're not. I think they are too, but there's no numbers in here that say that. Let's just make this clear. Both of these areas in the condo space are being affected. Anyways, it's interesting to see the disconnect right now between the rental market and the selling market, because even though, yes, the selling market is increasing in things like months of inventory, and there's this kind of disparity that's happening where there's creating a bit of a deal, it is still far less than the rental market has experienced. Far, far, far less. A whole other level. The only thing that can save us right now from an influx of inventory, though, on the purchasing and selling side, because the rental market's already gone to hell in a handbasket, and it's pretty much hit its bottom from what we've seen, or at least from what I've seen. But we still have some room to go on the buying and selling. And the only thing I think that will save us is a miracle, or like a superhero. I don't know which one. Which superhero would save us? I don't know. How about okay, I got one. The White Power Ranger. Probably wouldn't work, but it's Trump's favorite. It's also terrible. All right, moving on. I'm going to get some hot topics here. We're going to have some fun. Get into some of the big stuff that could have their own categories, but we're going to fly through them. Number one, TorontoStories.com. RE/MAX claims CMHC is fear-mongering in the housing market forecast. Did we not say this too? We saw this because we read that same RE/MAX article just a couple days ago, but I find it so interesting that they're getting called out now. They're calling out. You're saying you are just fear-mongering what CMHC has to say. They say this isn't the first time RE/MAX has called out Canada's federal housing agency for its bold forecast. The real estate company previously called the agency's initial housing market prediction, quote, panic-inducing and irresponsible. We covered that a few months ago. You probably remember. As RE/MAX points out in a recent article, CMHC's forecast no longer aligns with the current state of the Canadian housing market. Presently, activity in the Toronto and the Vancouver's real estate markets is continuing on an upward momentum. In the GTA, the sale of new homes was up a whopping 217% in August, a mark that was 110% over the 10-year average. Whoo! I don't know if I want to partner with that. That's just mad. Right? We got this fear mongering happening that's being claimed from CMHC, but whatever the opposite of fear mongering is, I guess FOMO is definitely coming from REMAX. So we've got some big division. Whether you believe prices are going to drop or rise, you're welcome here. We're going to talk about both sides, right? The humor is that there, I believe, are very legitimate points on both sides of the aisle. Having reviewed and gone through these things, and you guys have stuck with us over time, you have too. But you got to pick your team, right? We've got team number one? We got the international community, these outside reports, right? We got Moody's. We saw UBS today. These outside reports. And we got CMHC saying we got ourselves a problem. Don't buy. We got in a housing bubble, right? Then team number two, assuming you want to pick a team, is we got local investors, which we've heard some of them on our podcast in past shows. Very consistent answers, right? We've got banks. Banks seem to be on the line of success. And of course, the real estate industry are all standing on the side of prices are going to go up. And I generally tend to lean on that side. But that's not to say there are not very legitimate points that can be made on both sides. And the decision, guys, is up to you. It really, really is. But the conflict right now is getting super heated. Not like the US, but heated. Why does there exist so much division? If you think about it, like what's the real difference between Donald Trump and Barack Obama? Other than the fact that one gets made fun of for the color of his skin and the other is Barack Obama. That's a good one, right? But like coronavirus, it's not Trump's fault, right? Ebola wasn't Obama's fault. SARS wasn't Bush's fault. And only a handful of cases of herpes was Bill Clinton's fault. So let's not get mad at the politicians. Let's pick our side and decide where are you going to invest your real dollars. I know that was a bit of a hot topic. That got really heated. We're going to sizzle down our hot topics. Probably not. Next one. All right. According to the RBC Economics Housing Affordability Measure out this week, the proportion of income Canadians need to meet housing costs, so things like mortgages, taxes, utilities, fell 3.3 percentage points to 47.3% in the second quarter. In other words, based on our income levels, we're able to afford the things that we need to meet our housing costs, which is great news. And this article continues, and I don't need to read the whole thing to tell you, yeah, it's because of the government support to income. So we're going to move right along from that. Well, what happens when that support ends? Well, the kids that are on OSAP are learning this real fast. According to the star.com, deferral on OSAP payment ends today. This article didn't come out today. I think this was yesterday, but it's facing tens of thousands of dollars in debt and dismal job prospects. These postgraduates are worried. They say this, quote, all these students who are coming out with $50,000 worth of loans and only able to get either part-time or minimum wage jobs right now, I don't know if the government or anyone expects anyone to pay money back with money of that kind. We're now being affected when people don't have jobs right now. People can't pay rent on top of student loans. This is not going to affect, in my opinion, it's not going to affect the value of your real estate, but it is going to affect the rental market. It really will, because their affordability goes down the moment they're back on the hook. And if they were thinking they could have a lifestyle living in a cheaper condo because they got CERB or they've got all the deferrals available to their OSAP, well, that could change. Hopefully you don't have yourself lined up with a student like that. And of course, based on better dwelling, it could circle right back into prices anyways. All right, moving on. 5 more months of delays expected before completion of the Eglinton Crosstown LRT. We've talked about this in the past, but just want to let you guys know that they're now not expecting it to be completed until September 2022. A big thing. The building of transit in our city is a great opportunity for you to buy an area that's up and coming. And obviously the Eglinton Crosstown LRT is a huge one. But the big question floating around right now is, are we going to go back to stage 2? And the closures. I mean, we're already reducing hours of certain businesses. Speaking of which, Donald Trump walks into a Toronto bar that needs to close at 12 o'clock. It actually ruined the joke by putting too many details. Here's the joke, okay? I'm going to give you the real joke, dad joke for you. Donald Trump walks into a bar, right? And set it lower. That's the joke. Once you start adding too many layers. Not funny. Not funny. National Post. All right, we're going to start talking about the fear mongering coming from not yours truly. Yours truly would mean me. Your beautiful premier, Mr. Doug Ford. Randall Denley had an opinion piece from the National Post that says this: Ontario's new COVID models show everyone should stop panicking, especially Doug Ford. I think this is appropriate because anytime we're getting into these conversations, it needs to be balanced. Well, here is your big balancing act where we're saying, you know what, maybe we need to just chill. Daddy, chill. Ontario Premier Doug Ford has cast himself as the province's COVID-19 frightener in chief. That's not useful, not well supported by the facts, and it undermines everything his government has been trying to do. On Monday, Ford said the 700 new case count announced that day was, quote, deeply disturbing, right? And then he says it will be more complicated, more complex. It will be worse than the first wave we faced earlier this year. And we've talked about this. There's going to be a tsunami of people that get hit by COVID if we're not careful. Well, he says in this article that Ford offered nothing to back up his dire predictions, but the thought was that Wednesday's release of the province's latest COVID modeling projections would do that for him. So he took an extra step and said, you guys know when the COVID models come out, you'll see how bad it is. Well, now the COVID models have come out, and in fact, it doesn't say that that's the case. Instead, the presentation by the provincial health experts was a balanced and detailed analysis of a potential problem. He says this, the daily case count is always the number that makes headlines in the pandemic. It means a lot less than one might think. Daily numbers that are about as high as last spring's peak suggest we're right back where we started, but we're not. And then this article talks about all the things that we know about, right? The types of people that are getting it. In the spring, the tests, right? It was 7.5%. Now it's 1.5% of people getting tested that are coming up positive. There you go. Maybe Donald Trump is in the 1% after all. That's good. If Ontario had the testing capacity in the spring that it has now, the first wave's numbers would easily have dwarfed those we are seeing this week. But here's what it says. The modeling looks at 3 possible scenarios for the month ahead. And again, there is nothing panic-inducing there. So the numbers don't seem to be panic-inducing. But I mean, we're not going to talk about that because everybody's okay with being freaked right out. I mean, if it means if that's what you need to social distance, fine. But the fear mongering, man, the key element is the likely effect of rising case numbers on intensive care beds. The experts say the province can look after up to 350 COVID patients in extensive care before the volume begins to cut into other hospital demands. Here's the scenario. Scenario number 1. They say it might happen if the virus follows its spring pattern, but with a younger population affected. In other words, what's happening now, the numbers we see, the young people are affected, not the older people. That creates no hospital bed issue at all. In fact, Ontario is tracking below even that projection with just 35 COVID patients in extensive care today. During the spring, there was up to 264 people in ICU beds, just to put it into perspective. Scenario number 2, the next scenario is that like Michigan and contemplates what happens if the latest phase of Ontario's pandemic affects a mix of older and younger people. This could happen, but they say in this article, the ICU bed limit still wouldn't be exceeded. All right, let's go worst case. The only scenario that shows a problem is one based on the Australian state of Victoria. And it estimates that what might happen if the virus affects primarily older and vulnerable people? They are the main victims. That one, they say, would mean a partial curtailment of surgeries, although there's no reason to assume the disease will follow that path in Ontario. So even if everything were to flip, it's all old people and vulnerable people that all of a sudden get sick, we would really, the limitations here would be we need to curtail some surgeries. Very different story than we've heard in past days, is it not? Even if it does, they say, there's a capacity to expand the number of beds available for COVID patients, according to Christine Elliott, who made clear that on Monday, right? So people don't know what to think. This is the real problem. This is the controversy, right? Prime among them is the Ontario Hospital Association, and we talked about this, how they're urging we got to go back into stage 2. And this is why it seems to be so likely. If you were to ask me on Monday, does it seem likely going to stage 2? I would say yes. But now that I'm seeing what's coming out of Health Canada, which is definitely not being as promoted as the other side, it would seem no. There's really no need for that. The association is concerned about the pandemic overwhelming hospital capacity, but that seems unlikely based on the province's analysis. The biggest fear in the next few months ought to be, they say, an overreaction that further restricts personal freedoms and economic activity without the facts to justify it. Definitely a very opinionated point. Don't take away my personal freedoms. Don't close my business. The government's actions so far are appropriate to the scale of the problem, but when Ford warns of impending doom, it undermines that message and it creates fear in people who need confidence to work, shop, and send their kids to school. What a good point. I'm so glad. This is what I love about this podcast. We look at all angles as much as possible. Yeah, I'm biased, and so are you. But that doesn't mean we can't look at every angle. Full marks to the provincial government, though, for making public the expert assessment that informs the government's pandemic plan. Information is a wonderful antidote to fear. So what do you think? Do you think we're going to need to enter phase 2? Why or why not? Leave that down in the comments below. And politics in the meantime will be politics. You got to love Ford and Trudeau or you hate them, right? They're doing their best. I mean, it could be worse. We could have Trump running our country. And the only difference right now between Trump and a dump truck is 4 good years. I'm having fun. I hope you guys did too. I apologize. This podcast came out a little bit later than normal, but we make sure you guys are served going into the weekend, and I will catch you guys next time. Take care and keep it real.